Hi, my name's Amy Young. I'm a GTA here at CSU and I teach Fibers 1. Today I'm going to be doing a brief demo on applique and reverse applique. Applique is the process of adhering fabric to one another through the process of sewing. You can machine sew or hand sew. For this demo, I'm going to be showing some hand sewing methods and not machine sewing methods. And for reverse applique, it is pretty much the same process, but instead of the fabric being layered on top of one another, you're actually cutting away layers to show the layers underneath. Good examples of reverse applique are going to be these two examples I have here today, which is going to be this one where I've used like a translucent material that I've sewn on top of, and then I cut away the fabric so you can see the translucent underneath. This one's also a really great example of reverse applique. This floral fabric is the top layer. And if I move back these layers, you can see the layers underneath where the person had cut away and shown the other fabrics that are underneath. There's that middle fabric. And then a good example of applique is this piece that I did make myself, where I'm taking different layers of fabric, and then I used a machine stitch on this one where I just layered fabric and then sewed it to each piece one another. You'll need a sketch to start. You need to have a good idea of what you're going to do before you start, because otherwise it's kind of just chaotic and can get kind of crazy. Pieces that you cut out might not match up if you're not using a good draft or a good sketch to start with. A erasable pin that can go, that's specifically for fabric, or tailor's chalk, either one. And then I like to have a good pin around just for sketching, that sort of thing. A ruler or measuring tape, whichever you prefer. I'm a measuring tape kind of gal, but it's good to have a straight edge around. A rotary cutter or scissors. I like to have both on hand. Rotary cutter for your straight edges, scissors for your more fluid edges. Sewing needles. I've got this really old package here of sewing needles. I've got this little container of sewing needles here also. A pin cushion is good. You'll want some pins, or you'll want spray adhesive, whichever one you prefer. I use this Gorilla Glue brand, but you can use anything. If you're not wanting to kind of pin down every single piece, that's a good way to go. I prefer to pin down things generally, unless it's a really big piece of fabric, and then I prefer to use the adhesive. So it's good to have pins on hand, and then you'll need sewing thread to adhere the fabric together. This is going to be a must. I suggest finding colors that match the color of your fabric, that way it's not kind of sticking out, unless you want that effect. If you want to be able to see the threads that you're sewing together, I would suggest using something that really pops against whatever color of fabric you're using. It's good to have an embroidery hoop around also. That makes it really easy once you get to the sewing portion. I like to have sticky notes around so I can label pieces. If you don't have an iron at home, I understand. Anything that will get your fabric straight is good. I suggest an iron, but kind of use whatever you have around. I had started making a jean rug or a denim rug out of old pairs of jeans that I had around, and I didn't really want to use the pockets for the rug that I was making, that I was weaving, so I cut the pockets away, and then now I have all these interesting jean pockets left over. So I had considered things that I maybe needed around my house, and I actually need a makeup brush holder. So I figured what I would do is use these pockets as little makeup brush holders, but I wanted to make a fun design for the pockets to kind of sit on. The pocket sizes aren't going to change. These are finite, they're not going to change at any point, so I wanted to base my design around these. So what I did is I sketched out these pockets in relationship to a size of piece of fabric, and then I came up with a design that would go behind the pockets. And then these little circles that I've created here are going to actually be the reverse applique. So those areas are going to be the furthest back in the applique object. But I have my design, and now I'm going to move that onto a draft. I laid out all of these individual pockets on a piece of paper. So I traced those onto here, and then I decided the, I guess, space I wanted around the pockets and how I wanted them to fit spatially on the piece. So this is going to be my final piece. This is going to be the full edge of the piece. I'm going to hem this edge, but for that, you want to make sure that your piece of fabric actually extends past this edge. So even though this is my final edge, I'm actually going to cut my piece of fabric to go a little bit further past all those edges, just because that's going to get folded and made into a hem in the end. So this is going to be my final piece, but everything you cut, you want to give it a little bit of extra space for hemming, or just so it overlays correctly, things like that. So once I had those traced, I went ahead and drew out the rest of my design on here. You can see how that transferred. There's the original draft, here's the big draft. And I have a piece of fabric that I cut out that's going to be my base fabric. And this is basically what everything's going to be sewn to. This is the main fabric that everything will be placed on top of. And you can see this extends a little bit further than that original edge. I've got my base piece of fabric. I don't actually need to see this again, but I've cut that using a straight edge and a ruler. I already have my other fabrics labeled for what I'm going to use. These are my dots, so you can see on my design all those little dots that are kind of everywhere. Those will be filled in with these two fabrics. These are the stripe colors I chose, so I've got like a brown corduroy, this kind of fun like mod cloth, and a bit of a reflective orange. Whenever you're picking out your fabrics, you always want to try them together before you sew them together, because sometimes you think two fabrics go together and then they look awful together. The next step is going to be actually tracing from my draft. This is my draft. I don't want to cut this apart because then I'm not going to know where all these pieces go. I have everything numbered on here before I even start, so you can see my stripe. Even though it gets cut off in two different pieces, I'm going to go ahead and map it out as so. I have it labeled stripe 1.1, and then this is the continuation of that stripe, so I labeled it stripe 1.2, so I know exactly, it's still stripe 1, but there's a part 1 and a part 2. So I'll go ahead and go in. And then if you recall me earlier saying you always want to over trace. So right now I just have it traced as if it were the first trace or the normal trace. This is how I want it to line up once I have it done, but you're always going to overcut your fabric because you want more than you want less. If you have less, then things are going to look wonky and not line up correctly. If you have more fabric for that cut, then you can always kind of size it down or trim it once you have it actually adhered to your fabric. So I like to go back over maybe like a 1/4 inch. So this is going to be my final tracing. And then the next thing I'm going to do is immediately label this. So this was stripe 1.2, and then I can cut this out with scissors. So I have that piece cut out. That is stripe 1.2. I'm going to go ahead and cut out the rest of that stripe, which is stripe 1.1, and that's a much smaller piece. So now I have my material for stripe 1 done. I have my cutouts for stripe 1 already cut out. And I just want to try to make sure this fabric is as flat as I can get it to be. Ironing is your best friend in this situation. So I'm going to lay down my stripe cut out roughly where I want it. And then the tricky thing about using pattern fabric is you want to make sure the directionality of your pattern is the same for multiple pieces that you're cutting out for the same applique. Because what you don't want is, let's say you have a plaid, and then in one section you have the plaid going very diagonal, and then the other way you have it going horizontal. That's going to look very strange in your final product. So you want to make sure the directionality of your fabric is the same for each piece that you're cutting out. I'm going to use Taylor's chalk here. I'm just going to trace out my pattern. Okay, now that I have those traced, I'm going to go through and cut them out. So once I have that piece cut out very nicely, I'm going to take my original pattern piece, and if you have a lot of pattern pieces, I suggest doing this every single time. And I'm actually going to pin these two pieces together. So I'm going to pin that paper with the pattern piece to make sure I don't lose them. I've laid out my base fabric, which takes up the full sheet of my draft, you can see here. And then what I've done is taken that cutout of stripe 1.2, laid it out on top. I'm kind of using the draft to figure out exactly if I'm at the right spot. So I'll slowly lift the base fabric, look at my draft, see if it's lining up. And then I do the final check to make sure that everything's lining up well, and then I've cut this fabric out well. And how I do that is I take those pockets that are going to be on the very top and I lay them out where they're supposed to be on the final. So I'll lift my base fabric. It's supposed to go roughly right here. I'm going to try to get that as lined up as I can. It looks like it touches that first pocket. We have the first pocket down here. So it looks like this actually needs to move up some. Move it down a bit since I went a little over on that stripe. And I am going to line it up to the edge of that pocket. So your measurements are never going to be exact. Just know that. You might have to change your design just a tiny bit in order to fit all your pieces together in the end, but you just want to get as close as possible as you can. Once I have that lined up, and I feel like this is the right spot for all these pieces, I'm gonna get my pins, we're gonna adhere the stripes in. And then this big piece here might be some place where I might want to use spray adhesive. The other thing you have to be cautious about with spray adhesive is sometimes if you use too much, it'll leave like a watermark where you've used too much. So that's why I kind of tend not to use the spray adhesive unless I'm working with really giant sheets of fabric. I can move these pockets now. And I don't need a ton of pins, I just need to make sure that this isn't gonna move on me once I try to sew it. So this is my applique. So I'm just gonna go through and hand sew these two pieces of fabric together. You can use a bunch of different stitches. Any of the embroidery stitches that we went over in class would most likely work for something like this. So if you want something really decorative, you could even use like French knots to adhere these together. If you want to do some decorative stitches, feel free to. Just know that's going to take more time. I've also cut out my reverse applique section. It's just a little dot, and it's going to be the first dot at the very top of the piece. And this part doesn't need to be as exact as the stripes do. The stripes are going to be lining up together. These, I'm just going to be cutting a hole where the fabric is going to be adhered to the back. So these don't really need to be as perfect as the stripes do. So I'm just going to kind of like somewhat line it up. This is reverse applique. So these pieces, the stripes went on top of our base. The reverse applique sections, which are the dots, are actually going to be behind the fabric. So I've taken my base fabric, I've got my reverse applique fabric, I'm going to lay my base fabric over that. I'm actually going to pin through to the back. And so on the front we can't see it yet, but just know that it's actually adhered to the back. Alright, so now I'm getting needle and thread ready. I'm going to take those two ends that go through the needle, and I generally would just tie a knot on one of those edges, but this time I'm actually going to take both of those edges and tie a knot with both of them, because I actually want my thread to be double thick. I want to have a pretty good strength on it because we're going to be hand sewing, and hand sewing is notoriously less sturdy, I would say, than machine sewing, and you want to make sure you get it as sturdy as possible, and the easiest way to do that for me is to double it up. And you can see I've already put my embroidery hoop on top of my pattern, and that's going to help me sew a little bit quicker. So I'm going to come up through one side of this edge. Again, the knot should be on the bottom side of your fabric on the back so we don't see that. And if you'd like to use embroidery floss for this, you can also. I like to use thread just because it's a little less visible, but if you actually want your stitching to be very visible, you can use embroidery floss on this instead of thread. And so what I'm going to do is, generally whenever you think about sewing, what you're doing is you're going in through the back, pull it to the back, and then you come back up through the front, and it's kind of a motion of going in and out, in and out, in and out. To make this go a little bit quicker for hand sewing, and especially with the embroidery hoop it helps to do this, is where your stitch would go next. You'll go through both layers of fabric to the back, and then instead of actually pulling it out and then going back through the front, I'm just going to go ahead and do my next stitch and pull that needle through the front. So, and then I'm just going to continue that stitch all the way to the front. And then that way we're not having to go back in and out, we're just going through, up, through, up, through, up. And that's going to help us achieve a much quicker sewing pattern. And you want to get your stitches pretty even. Right now I'm just doing a straight stitch so you can see kind of where the stitch goes in a pattern and comes up through the fabric, especially in that brown section. You can see where that is. And then once I'm done, you'll go to the back side of the fabric, pull my needle to the back side of the embroidery hoop, and I'll go ahead and tie a knot. So I've got my reverse applique here. You can see I have it at the front of my embroidery hoop because I want to be able to see what I'm doing on this side a little easier. So this time I actually want my knot to be on the side that we can see the applique, because this is the back of the piece. You always want your knots on the back of the piece. You don't want them on the front. So I'm going to go through the front side first instead of going up through the back first. I'm going to go ahead and start sewing this in. Alright, and I'm all the way back to that first stitch I did. So I'm going to tie a knot. And so now I have that circle, I'm going to pull the pin out because the pin is no longer needed. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm trying to hold this fabric, but not hold the front fabric. And I want to keep those two layers kind of separate if I can, because what I'm going to do is cut the front fabric just enough that I can get my scissors through there, and I don't want to cut the back fabric because that's the fabric that's going to show through. And I'm just going to kind of cut around the stitches I've made. And you'll see that fabric shows through that little hole. And then if you just want it to be kind of casual like this where there's a scissor edge around, that's great, you can leave that. Or you can kind of do a blanket stitch around that edge. You can see here I just did the normal stitch around, similar to how we did on our main fabric that I'm showing you for the demo today. But I went back in and did a blanket stitch around the edge so that you don't see those raw edges where the scissors cut, and you just see a really nice stitch that kind of borders that edge. Do whatever you feel. This is a pretty quick project for being a hand sewing project, so I don't expect anything like this, but if you'd like to have those sort of finishings, you could. So that is applique and reverse applique. Feel free to use any of the embroidery techniques that I showed you guys in class, but this is kind of how you would start something hand sewn. Plan beforehand, have ideas of what you want to do, and try to follow those plans as much as you can, and you should have a pretty successful piece in the end. But yeah, thanks.